evening, good afternoon, wherever in the world you are, and welcome to the Raisina dialogue. Today's panel, it's on the trail of the bear, Russia in a multipolar world. We have a very eminent panel with us. We have the Honorable Dr. Shashi Tharoor, a former Minister of State of External Affairs of India and a former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and a current Member of Parliament. We have Deputy Minister Sajjadpour from Iran. We have Dr. Bistrisky from Russia, Ms. Novens from the Royal United Service Institute, and Dr. Lekacheva from Moscow. Welcome to all of you. Welcome to the Raisina dialogue. We look forward to interacting with you on this extremely important topic. Russia has always been a great nation. You know, whether you from 1815 till 1990 till 1945, today it's never ceases it never ceases to impress in its capacity to stay the course. Its capacity to insert itself into the great political currents of the world. It is a nation with great reserves, always surprises, and it's always at the table. So, in the Raisina fashion, we plunge straight into the debate. And the first question I'm going to ask is of Ms. Novens. And the question is, where has Russia re-emerged as a player in today's geopolitical and geoeconomic situation?
It's a really interesting question, and thank you for having me on today. I mean, I focus on the Indo-Pacific region, so for me, Russia's re-emergence in the Indo-Pacific region is quite interesting. Of course, Russia doesn't itself recognize the Indo-Pacific as a strategic concept. It sees it very much as something being anti-China and possibly also anti-Russia in that mix as well. But it does have strategic interests in that confluence of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. We see that, of course, in stability in the the Korean Peninsula. We see that in the development of the Far East. Russia's role in terms of the Arctic as building a bridge and a new maritime route between Europe and the Pacific. And then, of course, the various engagements that it's had throughout the region, be it through China, its relationship with India, but even, ASEAN and then the Western Indian Ocean and African coast. So there are strategic interests there, and we do see more engagement with Russia in this space. I guess the question is, to what extent is there cooperation with China in the Indo-Pacific? Where are the key areas of focus for Russia in this part of the world? There's a lot of activity and concentration at the moment around the new naval base in Port Sudan, the kind of activity and relationship with India and how that's evolving, and then more generally the kind of military, economic, and political role that Russia will be playing, I think, in the Indian Ocean region in particular. So for me personally, this is a really interesting development.
Thank you. Dr. Bistrisky, would you like to add to that from the Russian perspective? The question, if I were to I'll repeat it, where has Russia emerged as a player? We can't hear you, Dr. Bistrisky.
Excuse me. I would like to say that short answer on your question is everywhere. But the most important that the world configuration is changing before our eyes. We must understand that all regions are in the context of new world. It's very important because Russia and Russian political elite, it seems to me, has recognized that we should find new balance. We should find new configuration of this world. And all countries, including the most powerful ones, are in a difficult situation. Each of them, like Russia, needs to find its own way. And at the same time, no stable balance of powers can be achieved today. in the near future we will live in the system of ad hoc alliances. And Russia is trying to build maybe short, maybe long configuration for solving today problems, real problems. For instance, in Middle East, there are some tensions in Far East, Korean Peninsula, and so on and so on. Russia has some ambitions and ideas about future, and own understanding of about how we can organize our world. And the main idea of Russia is suggest own vision and to share it with other countries. Of course, there are a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of mistakes, but at the same time, we are looking answers to one question. Why do we need, for instance, why do we need United States? It's a very nice country, very interesting, huge, powerful, but what for? What they're looking for in these countries? Okay, maybe United States can be useful, perhaps. The same questions to Russia. Why do we need to each other? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bistrisky. Everywhere, that's a good answer. And to take that forward, can I ask Minister Sajjadpour a follow-up question? The follow-up question is, what does the renewed presence of Russia mean for the existing power balance in the areas, in the geographies where Russia is if I may use the term, resurgent or has re-emerged? Minister, we can't hear you. I think you're muted.
First of all, let me thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be in Raisina. Still, I have echo, but I hope you can understand what I talked about. I think there are 3 points in this very specific question to answer. First of all, I think Russia has been a great power for decades, but the intensity and active role of Russia has differed from time to time and place to place. The second point is Russia, after Libyan crisis and what it saw and witnessed, I think had a type of shift, didn't follow the other Western patterns of involvement in the Middle East, and it started its own course. And it was based on a strategic calculation, which I think was right. And finally, it eventuated in a very interesting course of actions in the totality of the region. And I think the issue of Syria here is very important. And when you read the file of the Russian involvement in Syria, and you see Iranian, Russian cooperation on this board, you see this great this global power, plus a regional power like Iran, it really became game changer. And I think strategically, it is a place that gave Russia a leverage not just in the region, but a global role also, which needs to be identified. And I think the third point is Iranian-Russian relationship by itself, not just as a function of other evolutions and development. I think there is much bilateral relationship which has regional and global impacts and consequences. So to answer your question tersely, Russia has been constantly a player, but its role has been increased and it has become a game changer in regional and global.
Thank you, Minister Sajjadpour. Russia has always been a great player, and that's a perspective on from you as one of the key players in the Middle East. One of the points that Ms. Novens made was about Russia's equation with India. Can I ask Dr. Tharoor to weigh in on that, and what this renewed presence, I don't think you could say it's renewed when it comes to India, but what it means for the balance of power in whichever region you choose to speak about, sir, or the whole world. Thank you.
Right. Well, I mean, there's no question, Anupam, that everything around is in a state of flux. And that includes the Indo-Russian relationship. In fact, I think we tend to forget that when the Indo-Soviet Treaty of '71 lapsed, that it was replaced by an India-Russia strategic partnership in October 2000, which in 2010 was elevated to the level of a special and privileged strategic partnership. So one should actually assume that these are two countries that have a lot going for and with each other. There are ambitious commitments to increase trade and investment, which are in the course of being met. The investment target is already doing extremely well. Trade growing a little more slowly, but it has grown consistently since 2017 after many years of decline. So at one level, I would say the relationship has been continuing to grow despite the way in which the world has changed from the end of the Cold War, the end of the unipolar moment, the emergence of China, and all of this stuff. When people begin to raise questions, you can say, well, the objective facts suggest things are not that bad. But there are some elements that suggest that, that things are not so good between Russia and India as they used to be. I mean, one is certainly the concern that Russia has become very noticeably closer to China at a time when China's proximity to Pakistan has been a matter of growing concern to India, and where tensions on India's border with China have actually erupted for the first time in almost 50 years into a loss of life. This has been a very serious development, and of course, if Russia is being friendly to the country that has done this to us, that is undoubtedly going to raise certain questions in India's mind. At the same time, because India has a very powerful Russia relationship legacy, India has strong incentives to hold on to that relationship, and because of India's, if you like, ideological commitment to the notion of strategic autonomy, we always want to tell each of our partners that our relationship with them is bilateral, and we will not allow third-party relations on either side to influence that. But look at the challenge we're facing in our own region. You are seeing undoubtedly mounting concern about China amongst many countries in the region. In parallel, you're seeing the rise of an alternative grouping calling itself the Quad, which includes 4 democracies, the US, Australia, South Korea, Japan, along with us. South Korea not formally, there would be a quint if you like, but the other 4 are already meeting regularly, twice, 3 times now at foreign minister level. So that's emerging. And there is a perception that emerging on the other side of this, on the opposite side, is a China, Russia, Pakistan trilateral that could well be seen as putting India in an adverse position. Now, India would like ideally to preserve its close relationship with Russia, its annual summits at head of government level, its extraordinarily strong cooperation on defense. We've just gone ahead, for example, to spending $5 billion on state-of-the-art S-400 defense systems, which comes despite warnings from the US that such an acquisition could trigger sanctions from the US under existing legislation, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, or CAATSA. All of that, of course, raises awkward issues for India. How do we assert to the Americans that we have our own point of view? How do we assert to the Russians that our relationship with them still matters, while at the same time signaling to both sides concerns about their broader concerns? Now look at India vis-a-vis China and Russia. Surely to say to the Russians that we are uncomfortable with you getting too close to China and Pakistan it gets difficult when the Russians are saying to us they're uncomfortable with us getting too close to the US. So there is a level of discomfort rising on both sides of the equation. which we haven't seen before. So this is all in a state of flux. I don't mean to take much longer, but when we are partnering with the US in the Quad, in the Indo-Pacific, while reaffirming our traditional ties with Russia bilaterally and on the Eurasian continent, we have a particular challenge. When Sergei Lavrov, my old friend, who's the foreign minister for many years now, came to India, it was striking that his counterpart, Minister Jayashankar, spoke of the Indo-Pacific, and Sergei spoke of the Asia-Pacific. These are not accidental sort of linguistic differences. These are very clear conceptions of the region and of shifting in different perspectives between the two countries. So watch this space, as they say. I don't have a clear answer except to say that matters are in flux and will have to be very delicately managed on both ends.
Thank you, sir. Indo-Pacific versus Asia-Pacific, levels of discomfort, state of flux. The speakers have spoken about the Middle East, about the Indo-Pacific. Can we turn to Russia and Europe? And Dr. Likhatcheva, could you tell us something about how Russia is going to, how Russia's re-emergence is affecting the balance of power situation or the geopolitical equations when it comes to Russia and Europe?
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting and organizing such an interesting discussion. First of all, I think that this re-emergence means much less linear and easy solutions for everyone. And at the same time, it opens door for more dialogue and more set of opportunities for third countries. We mentioned some hard security issues, and we focus on them naturally. And the fields to come, like food security, water security, social security, broader humanitarian security, Russia can be and aims to be a very important player and has enough assets to do so. And in all these fields, it's much easier to find these delicate solutions that respect really multilateral and multipolar interests that the countries in Russia's areas of interest face. To add more, I think that this re-emergence meets the global trends and processes regarding what's going on with international order and how Russia sees itself within it. For example, if we speak about the agendas, to Russia, an opportunity to pursue its own agenda, the privilege of not to join to some other's agenda is a key priority, is a key interest. But what we see in India, in China, in the Middle East, in Turkey, in Iran, everywhere, this privilege to set your agenda, or at least to be free from joining the agenda of the third alter, is an extremely high asset. So here I think that Russia will find more and more partners to discuss different agendas and maybe meets the ones, maybe not. But we have so many global challenges and problems now that unfortunately that's a very good moment to keep this dialogue.
Let me press you a little on that, Dr. Likhatcheva. You said that setting the privilege of not joining anyone's agenda. So what would be Russia's agenda when it comes to, say, the Middle East or the area or the greater Middle East or that area?
Well, I think it's very consecutive. What Russia does at the Middle East, that's the quintessence of its approach of multilateral dialogues, of respect of sovereignty of the others and the protection of it as much as possible. It's, in general, I would call it high precision foreign policy. It's very hard to get. It takes lots of efforts to do, but when you use it, it's very targeted efforts with very impressive results. Of course, you can fail while you're trying to get it. You can make mistakes, but since you get it, it can work. It really can work. It's not only for the Middle East, for example, sanction policy or vaccines. Vaccines is a perfect example of this high precision foreign policy philosophy. Hard to get, but when you do, you're open for partnerships. Russia suggests to launch joint production in other countries without pursuing, we want to produce everything for everyone. So, yes, that's formula works, I hope.
Thank you. Ms. Nowens, can I ask you about, can we go on to the next part of it and talk about Russia's conception of its place in the world? What do you think of, how do you think Russia sees itself, and how does this affect the future of the global order? I think that's the question that all of us have. So can we have your views on that?
Sure. I mean, I think I'm speaking more as an outsider observer of Russia than of a Russia expert in that itself. But I mean, it seems to be that Russia is moving away from a position of, one that was seen as very opportunistic, very kind of small and ad hoc in at least the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, in some ways seen a little bit as a spoiler as well, to one where it is carving out more of a niche, or seeking to carve out more of a niche for itself in this area, for its own strategic interests, of course. But again, as has already been mentioned, this is quite interesting in relation to its own relationship with China. That relationship, though very wide, and of course it seems increasingly so into various different sectors and different areas of that partnership and collaboration, I think to a certain extent is still not as deep as we would imagine it to be. I think Russia-China relations in terms of trust still has a far way to go. But it does seem that Russia has put a lot of its eggs in the China basket. And in that sense, how it operates in the Indo-Pacific region, at least, particularly I think in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, while it is trying to carve a role out for itself, it has, I think, accepted that it is to a certain extent China's junior partner. And we see this kind of evolving, in other areas as well. So that Russia-China collaboration element can be seen in the Antarctic, where we're seeing cooperation being stepped up, Russia-China cooperation in outer space as well, more general cooperation when it comes to, aligning themselves together on new global governance standards. All of those, are avenues, I think, for Russia to have more of an influence on the international stage by partnering with China. So I think in that sense, that does, I think, to a certain extent, raise interesting questions for how Russia, as our previous speaker said, will be carving out its own unique kind of individual agenda and its own role and interests in the Indo-Pacific. And that will be an interesting way to see how it positions itself as offering itself perhaps as a third-party alternative to the United States and China, but at the same time remaining incredibly close to China in a number of areas.
Interesting. Junior partner to China. And how would you react to that, Dr. Bistricky, in the light of what you said earlier about Russia having its own, sort of priorities and its own interests in various theaters?
Russia is all countries, not only Russia, but Russia is in very difficult situation, like other countries, because we should think about how we can maneuver in this situation. What should we do? Because today configuration is very, very strange, in some sense weird, and we need and Russia needs to find has to find way between Western Europe, United States, China, India, neighbors, former Soviet republics, and a lot of problems, including COVID-19. And I think that maybe I mean Russia, not only Russia, we can find solution and to find some way. First of all, we should think about new and common narrative, because nobody knows future. During confrontation between the United States and Soviet Union, we can say that, okay, we are looking at this kind of future or another kind. No, we don't have common values. We have no common image of future. It's a very serious change. If we find the model of future, maybe we can find way how can we reach this future. It's first. Second, maybe Russia should find more support, more allies in the Central Asia region. I mean, some former Soviet republics. I mean, Iran, and it will be very important for Russia, India. Honestly, I don't know answer, because it seems to me there are a lot of challenges, and what should be doing in this situation? Now Russia has recognized we need to be strong, to have own power, and to follow our policy, and to looking for some world justice and world balance. Thank you.
Dr. Pistusi, thank you. Common image of the no common image of the future. And you just mentioned Iran as a key partner. Minister Sajjadpour, can I ask you about what about your image of the future, and what do you have in common with Russia, or is there a narrative that you think that you can build on with Russia in that?
I think
I think you're muted, sir. You need to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I think Russia is a fundamental and key player in shaping a new multi-century global order. And I think I emphasize on that because there are tendencies still in the West, and particularly in the United States, for a type of unicentric worldview. And I think Russia, China, Iran, of course, with different degrees, are trying, and India, of course, I think are to be recognized as a set of shapers of a multi-century global order. And I think this is a very strategic point to be analyzed. And I think the second point is Iran is a genuine regional player because of its two elements. First is, let's say, natural strategic location and natural qualities. Plus, second is its achievements. Its achievements during the course of last 4 decades is a player in its own region with global impact. So if you look at this two set of facts that I mentioned, the Iranian-Russian relationship becomes very important, not just for a bilateral system, but it is also becoming very important in a much more multi-centric global order. And if you add, and I want to underline another fact, and that is how the West at its totality is treating Russia. How the United States is treating Russia. And I think it has ripple effect on how Russia will react. And this is what I think is very important in this multi-centric global order, is the rise of Eurasia as a strategic theater. And I think in this whole geopolitical setting of Eurasia, Russia is a very fundamental player, China is a very fundamental player, India is a very fundamental player, and of course Iran and Turkey and a few others. And I'm not going just to the, let's say, classical rivalry between different, let's say, global powers. I think it's a new setting in which, of course, Russia has something to add, Iran has something to add, and of course India. And I think even the trilateral interaction between players like India, Russia, and Iran, as well as other trilaterals, can help shaping a new reality. To end, the world is not as vertical as it was, and there are horizontal changes here and there. And in these horizontal changes, players like India, like Iran, like Turkey, I think matter so much, and of course Russia. And I think this is where Eurasia becomes a very, very important civilizational, strategic, political context in which Russia has a great role.
Mr. Sajjadpour, thank you very much. I'm going to press you a little on this. You talked of...
I think you are muted. You are muted.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
You are
Can you hear
muted.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? No? Can you hear me now? I think
I'll be happy to pick up the slack on that if you want, Anupam.
yes, sir. Please do.
I mean, I just think Minister Sajjadpour's was a very important intervention, and I happen to agree with much of what he said. I think that the world has been evolving in a very interesting way from the binary of the Cold War, which was really with two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the US, then the unipolar period when the US was really the unchallenged power, Russia trying to figure out its place in that. Then comes the Primakov doctrine, where the Russians start charting out their own course, rather than the completely pro-Western policy of the first half of the 90s. Meanwhile, you have the gradual emergence and rise of China. People are sensing the rise of a new bipolarity with China as the other pole. But Russia, like India and others, are saying, wait a minute, we don't want another bipolar world order. We want to see more of a multipolarity. And Russia, certainly as a recent superpower, has the capacity, particularly the military and strategic capacity, to be able to actually translate that into something meaningful in terms of its geopolitical presence. And that's why when Mr. Basisia talked about Russia emerging everywhere, I think he's right, because you've got the annexation of Crimea, you've got the war in eastern Ukraine, in which Russia was largely able to impose its will, the military deployment in Syria, which was pretty much determining of the outcome. If it were not for the Russian intervention, Syria's war would have turned out very differently. Then, of course, you've got the standoff with the West in the Black Sea, in the Baltic Sea, perhaps even in some of the issues of US and European domestic politics, where Russia has been seen as a player. So Russia has been able to demonstrate that it is a major power with significant capability to project power. Project power not just in its own backyard. So if you think of Russia, strategic interests as being about its own neighborhood, or making sure that its fundamental interests in its own neighborhood are protected, that's no longer enough. It is clearly projecting a very significant amount of power beyond its neighborhood. It is an independent center of power on the world stage. It is contributing to the development of a multipolar world. But, and this is the catch for us here in India, is seeing the extraordinary level of the relationship with China, because we have to admit that the Russia-China relationship today is so much greater than anything, for example, that we used to pride ourselves on in terms of a special relationship. They import more of their arms from Russia than we do, and of course in dollar terms that's multiples more. Their trade is 10 times our trade with Russia. Their investment levels are 10 times more. In fact, China accounts for 85% of the total foreign investment in the Russian Far East. And with the development of the Russia-steered Eurasian Economic Union, which which Moscow has been leading, and talk of it, coupling it with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative to create a greater Eurasian partnership, the stakes between the Chinese and the Russians and each other are so much greater than any stakes that Russia has with us, for example, that in the event of a hostile relationship erupting into worse situations with China, Russia would find itself in a very different place. And this puts us in a very complicated situation. India steered a very effective non-aligned course throughout the Cold War. But suddenly it finds that when the superpower divide is in its own backyard, on its own borders, and that some players who were very close friends during one era might have a more nuanced or even less supportive position in the new era, we have to also re-examine our options. Now, I won't speak for Iran. Minister Sajjadpour has done that very effectively. But we are seeing signs of Iran re-examining its own relationship with China, with Russia, particularly given the Trumpian era of renewed sanctions and so on. And that would again have implications for Iran's otherwise healthy relationship with India, because again, China may have more to offer than India would. So all of these questions suggest that my initial answer to you, Anupam, that we are in a state of flux, is underscored. And indeed, Russia's geopolitics and Russia's influence on all these countries we've talked about will have a significant bearing on how this pattern plays itself out in the next decade or so.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to push your statement on to Dr. Lekhacheva and ask her about, one of the very interesting terms that was used a little earlier is a high-precision foreign policy. And I would like to understand from the Russian perspective that, as there's a lot of conversation about the passing of the liberal order. There has been a comment in our session, very interesting session on Eurasia, on the Russia's relationship with China, on Iran. Now, my question to you is, presumably that something would replace this liberal order. How do you handle, we've all talked of convergences, and Dr. Tharoor talked of divergences. How do you handle divergences in this area, and what could some of these divergences be amongst partners here?
Well, actually, I would like also to support this idea of Eurasia as not just as a theater as a very important theater of action, but as a goal, particularly for Russia, clearly set, and not Russian theater. Russia clearly states that it should be an inclusive partnership, because it's openly admitted that otherwise it would quickly turn in anti-Chinese project that Russia doesn't want, obviously. What Russia wants is this new order that is actually more as a disorder by now, is at least in Eurasia, as much as possible to be a cooperative environment. Cooperative environment with lots of conflicts. That's clear that conflicts are numerous and they could multiply in coming years. But the spirit of this environment should be cooperative. That's why Russia engages in different institutional frameworks and tries to multiply various networks, not just like financial, like non-dollar networks, but social or humanitarian networks. Geographical networks with these projects of transport corridors, particularly the stress on higher share of Russian-Chinese cooperation, is part of the answer is also in geography, and we could expect that coming north-south transport corridor could really contribute to more intense engagement of Russia in this southern Eurasian project. What Russia doesn't want in this order, at least in its not a backyard, but the open place for cooperate, it's too huge to be a backyard. Conflictual environment with some blicks of cooperation when it's a real critical moment. That's what we have in mostly in Russian-Western relations. So this dividing line is very clear. But as if we speak about an order in general, how it could develop, I would like just to add that maybe a very easy analogy with junglification of world politics could be here. We usually consider jungles of international politics as a very vulgar example of direct rule of power, and that's it. But in fact, what the law jungle means is to prevent tragedy of the commons. And that's actually what we fail. By now, not only, for example, in climate change, where this tragedy of commons is obvious, but with vaccines as well. When it's drought, animals manage to cooperate near the water source. And during the COVID, and despite all the lockdowns, we see that countries cancel to share vaccines, and that's a very dramatic symptom that we can find ourselves only in the order driven by power only, without any concern of global survival of the habitat. That is that clearly does mean Russian interests. That's what we see both in the Arctic, in Asia, in the Far East, Russian recent activities in the maritime environment. It's not only about projecting power. It's also about putting huge efforts not to avoid to the habitat to turn into a disaster.
Thank you, Dr. Lebedev. It's not just about power. A very, very comprehensive, your talk about geographical networks, infrastructure networks, climate change, not being the law of the jungle. We are in the last 5 minutes, and I'm going to ask each of you to speak for a minute. Ms. Newens, you first. Where do you think the biggest divergences are going to come between Russia and the many partners that were mentioned in this conversation?
I mean, I wondered if I could maybe just comment on what was just said, because that was all really interesting. And I certainly agree that, a multipolar world is reflective of, the world that we're in at the moment. And I don't think that that's necessarily ignored or not recognized in the West. I mean, we've been speaking about the growing role of India and, of course, the role that China rightfully plays in the Indo-Pacific region itself. So I don't think that's necessarily under dispute. I think what is, the challenge here is the different visions of what that world, what that multipolar world looks like. And so as we engage with middle powers around the world, trying to work to fill that vacuum that great power competition between China and the United States leaves, which nobody really wants to get caught up in, I think there is tension around, the order, the principles, the values, the standards that we're all looking at to create the next or an evolved international order. And there, I think, we see major divergences. So, the problem isn't a multipolar order. The problem is we don't seem to be on the same page as to what that order and what the principles are that that order will base itself on. And there, I think, clearly, there needs to be much more work done. There's a lot of lack of trust. That continues to be the case vis-a-vis Russia in Europe, and I'm sure vice versa. That continues to be the case with China. So the question is really, I suppose, what does a positive vision for that world order look like for Russia, and in what areas are there areas of convergence potentially? I would question the assumption that this is not just about power, but that Russia is also interested in other areas like climate change. I mean, we're all interested in these things, of course, but I guess even here we have differences in opinion on how to tackle some of these challenges. When it comes to, say, even the Antarctic, the balance between resource exploitation and conservation of the environment, again, there we don't agree. And so I think there's, it's definitely not just about power, it's a lot about principles. And there, I think, lies the crux of where we look at moving ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Newens. Minister Sajjadpour, what keeps you awake at night when you think of Central Asia and various the important players in that area? What are the possible divergences that could create problems?
3 quick points. First, I think assumptions about Russia needs to be revisited. We have been addicted to a certain, let's say, assumptions about Russia which are repeated here and there. I think Russia is different, is a player which needs to be kept into account. I think Russia is one of the builders of the new international order, along with others. So we have to keep this building capacity of Russia seriously. And I think my C and final point, cooperation is the key, be it bilateral and multilateral. So cooperation with Russia for us has been very positive, bilaterally, multilaterally. So I think the key concept is instead of having conflictual views, focus on cooperation.
Conflict, replace conflict with cooperation. That's your message, Minister Sajjadpour. Thank you. Dr. Bistrisky, closing remarks. Where do you see Russia, what the most important things for Russia in its foreign policy in the near future?
Most important thing for Russia today is world justice and replacing of hypocrisy. It's a problem because, first of all, when the contemporary world is a little bit strange because now we have a terrible problem with communication between countries, with mutual understanding, trust, and so on and so on. It's a main problem of information, of new information technologies. It's a serious challenge and maybe more dangerous than we think, because there is a lack of information about a real situation with between countries and so on and so on. I see a lot of worries about Russia-China relationships. It's interesting, but of course these relations depends on Russia and China. It's clear. But at the same time, these relations depends on other countries. First of all, from Western Europe, for instance, and so on and so on. I see attempts of many countries to restore old world order. Unipolar, more hierarchical, in some sense injustice. And it's a serious challenge. We should recognize that we are living a new world, new multipolar world. And we should build new type of relations between countries. Not only Eurasian Economic Union. Okay, let's see Russia and Latin America relations. It's very interesting because we can find our own decisions. We should rethink today model and today world hierarchy. I think it's a terrible mistake of Western elite to think that Western culture, United States and Western Europe, they're leading countries. Yes, in some sense, yes, leading, but the world is changing. It's a very serious and very long conversation, but we have to finish as soon as possible because. Okay, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for invitation and participation in such interesting conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. My personal thanks to all the very distinguished and eminent panelists who gave a diverse and a geographically and intellectually diverse point of view about Russia. Thank you for joining this dialogue. Very interesting discussion. Thank you very much.